Hi, everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, July has a lot of dates that are very, very memorable, and we talked about three of them last week, namely Canada Day on July 1, our Independence Day on July 4th, and Bastille Day, which is a big holiday in France, which was on Sunday the 14th. Well, July 16th, we've got another anniversary coming up, and one very, very important to the United States. It's the 50th anniversary of our landing on the moon. And I think, people that, let's say are over 50, us elderly folks, can kind of remember where we were on that day. The day was a Sunday. It was a Sunday evening. And I was up at the University of Vermont at the time, doing a summer program on public safety. And I remember we were watching it on CBS. Walter Cronkite, of course, was right in his prime then. He was doing the narrating. And everybody was very, very tense. This was something that had never really been done before, and it was a heck of a big gamble. There you had one of our satellites circling around the Earth, and we were going to drop two of our astronauts. It was a three-man crew. We're going to drop two of them on the moon and then try to retrieve them. A huge, huge gamble and a huge scientific feat if it could be done. Well, on that crew, as you know, were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Tim Collins. And Collins stayed aboard the spacecraft, while Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong went in the separate module, dropped down on the moon. And Armstrong was the first human to walk on the moon, and we remember his famous line, one small step for man, a giant step for mankind. And the moon landing was successful, but everybody held their breath. Now, is this little module going to be able to fire back up, rejoin its mothership, or are those guys going to be stranded on the moon forever? Well, as electrifying and as important as landing on the moon, I think even more important was whether or not they're going to be able to get off. And of course they did. They were able to pick up a few samples and stuff like that, plant the flag, and they were able to get back in their little module, fire it up. There was enough rocket power there to get it back up to the mothership. They linked up successfully and came back home, and our moon mission was a success. And this was a huge achievement for American science. When we started our space program, we had a major embarrassment. The United States wanted to be the first in space. And our first space launch, which was an unmanned capsule, fired off the rocket. The rocket went up, turned around, came back down, and left our little space capsule rolling along the beach. Now, the first successful launch of an astronaut in space went to our arch rivals, the Soviet Union. And they were able to launch Sputnik. And the first man in space was a Russian. And my senior moment here, his name escapes me right now. So it had the United States in a catch-up mood. And everybody kind of woke up. Congress woke up, started putting some money into the space program, started working on some rockets that were more effective. Wernher von Braun, who in World War II was the mastermind of the V-1 and V-2 rockets that Germany used to launch against London toward the end of World War II, was in charge of our, he wasn't really in charge, but he was the mastermind behind our space program. And we were able, eventually, to launch a man in space. And our first launch was very, very short. Launched up, arched, landed in the Caribbean, launched off the coast of Florida, what has become the Kennedy Space Center, and launched off the coast of Florida, went up, down, landed in the Caribbean, and they were able to save the astronaut. Our second one, I believe, was Scott Carpenter, and he stayed up a little bit longer, but landed in the Caribbean. Our first one to go around the world, of course, was John Glenn, and that was our third launch. He made one orbit around the globe and landed in the Pacific. And our space program was off and running. We've made several trips to the moon since then, and the fantasy of going to the moon has sort of faded out. But it was a tremendous achievement for the United States, but then we kind of let it go. And we kind of turned leadership of the space program over to Russia. Consequently, the space lab that is out floating around, when we want to send somebody up to it, they have to fly up on a Russian rocket. And, well, we kind of ceded our leadership in space to the Russians. But I think, looking back, this being our 50th anniversary, I think maybe it's going to revive interest in space. Maybe we're going to wake up and realize that we had leadership and we let it go. We blew it. And now maybe it's time to take it back again. And maybe it's time to once again send somebody to the moon. Right now, China has, I believe, launched a rocket that's hit the moon. The Russians have hit the moon. But I don't believe anybody has put any people on the moon outside of the United States. And I think we've had 7 moon missions with astronauts aboard. And that might be something we want to look at again and begin working on again. I know we, out of our Jet Propulsion Lab in California, and our scientists out there, we've been able to explore the planet Mars, even go beyond Mars. The wonderful exploration in space. And we still are far, far from having a complete knowledge of what's out there. And we know now that there's, with all the countries that have been able to launch, for example, you know, the United States, Russia, China, Japan has been able to get off a launch in outer space. There's a lot of junk flying around out there. And it's kind of hard for us to comprehend how vast outer space is. And probably in my lifetime anyway, I'm sure, and probably in yours, outer space will still be a big mystery. But, you know, you've got to keep exploring it. We know as a planet that it is very, very possible that we are not alone. That there may be other planets in other solar systems. We know our own solar system and the planets we have in it. But there could be other solar systems similar to ours. There could be another planet very, very similar to ours with people that are just like us, but in another solar system. There could be many, many like it. Or we could be the only one. That's something in our lifetime we probably will never know. Because right now we have our hands full trying to learn about our own solar system and how it works and how it functions. And we've got to keep exploring that and looking into it. It shows how far we have come in a very, very short time and how much progress science has made. Science has made progress in some areas that maybe it shouldn't. like trying to clone other human beings. Well, it's something I don't want to get into. But it is possible that in a matter of time they're going to be able to clone human beings and maybe make human beings even like robots. Who knows? Sometimes as you look at it and think, well, what are we going to do? It gets a little bit scary. But another big anniversary in July, and a tremendous, tremendous achievement for the space program of the United States, when we were able to not only get to the moon and navigate it, circulate around it, but drop a module on it with 2 astronauts aboard, have them explore for a short time, get back on that module, go back up and join the mothership, and come back to Earth. A tremendous, tremendous scientific experiment. You look back, well, let's look back to World War II, or go back beyond that. If you'd said that stuff, that was science fiction. That's never going to happen. That's in your imagination. But, well, sometimes science fiction becomes true. One thing I want to turn back to is the 4th of July. Our super idiot in the White House was making one of his, what he regarded as a very pompous address. And he talked about George Washington and the Continental Army, how they raided British ramparts and airports. You got to stop and think. The British had airports in the Revolutionary War? Good Lord, the airplane didn't come into existence well, you can call it 1904, although that was a very rickety thing. It only flew for a few seconds. But amazing. This man has looked into history and he's discovered that somehow or another the British had airports. Well, all the more power to them. They had airports, but they didn't have airplanes. And at the time of the American Revolution, if you talked about an airplane or something like that, they would know what you're talking about. That would have been science fiction for them. The biggest thing there was going from the horse to the stagecoach, going from corduroy roads to something that was brand new. They came from England a little bit later on. That was called macadam. Today we call it blacktop. But we have made a lot of progress. As I look back at my lifetime, I think I've lived at a very important historical time in the history of the world. Going from the Great Depression of the early 30s, I think of my father back in the 30s, working for Central Vermont Public Service, making a grand total of $6 a week salary, $6 a week salary. And yet with that, he was able to support a wife, 2 kids at the time, buy land, build a house. That's amazing. And we look at the conditions that existed at that time. You had the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, that did an awful lot of work. You had the DPW, Department of Public Works, and the WPA, Workers' Progress Administration, which was the federal program putting people to work. And here in Rutland City, they laid sewer lines, some of our sewer system as the city expanded, paved our roads. Route 7, originally it was a cement road. And, well, of course now it's blacktop. It's been widened out. At one time, Route 7 was just 2 lanes, going straight up through, up Gouger Hill, up past Christ the King, up into Pittsford Mills, and on into Pittsford. And you look at the expansion that has been done there. People were weren't even talking about an interstate then. You didn't know what an interstate was. And the interstate wouldn't come in, of course, until after World War II. And President Eisenhower is the one that pushed the interstate type highway. You know, the first thought of an interstate type highway through Vermont, a lot of people wanted to build it up on top of the mountains, right through the center of the state. But that idea was looked at and found to be a little bit impractical. So then you had a big battle, well, which side of the state is it going on? And there were promises made to the western part of the state that were never kept. That if the interstate went up the eastern side of the state, it was just a matter of time before improvements would be made to Route 7. And 7 would become a big 4-lane highway and be on a par with the interstate. Well, of course, that never happened. But the interstate highway system, when it came in the 50s, originally it was known as the National Defense Highway System. And the reason it was built was primarily we were, at that time, locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And it was no secret that the Russians were penetrating our northern defense and being able to fly down. Some of them were getting almost as close as Washington, D.C. And there's also a great fear that the Russians would send an army over the pole, down through Canada. And we needed these highways, especially the ones going north and south, to move our military convoys and to try and keep the war in Canada and keep it out of the United States. Well, over time, of course, it was found that these interstates did a tremendous job at moving traffic and moving it quite rapidly. And of course, you know, now we have a very extensive interstate system. It's no longer called the National Highway Defense System, but it's known as the interstate system. And it was modeled after the Autobahn in Germany. One of the things that Hitler did using slave labor was to build the Autobahn. And he could move troops back and forth because he was fighting a two-front war and eventually losing on both sides. But the idea of the interstate system came from the German Autobahn system. Another thing that comes to mind is the end of an era for the Volkswagen Beetle. Beetle, very popular little car at the time. The Volkswagen, it's German, it means people's car. Volks is people in German, and Wagen is car. So the Volkswagen was the people's car. And as wonderful as it was, unfortunately, it was a brainchild of Adolf Hitler. That's the drawback on it. But after the war, it became very, very popular in the United States. It was a very small engine, and something that was considered revolutionary at the time. The engine was in the back. In the front end was where you put your luggage and all that. But the Volkswagen engine was in the back, a very small engine. And you also had an auxiliary gas tank. So if your regular tank ran out of gas, there was a little lever you pushed, and the auxiliary tank would feed in until you get to a gas station and refuel. Well, the last Beetle, if you will, to come off the assembly line, of all places, came off the assembly line in Mexico. And I'm sure it's just a matter of time before the Volkswagen Beetle will become a collector's item. Revolutionary, a lot of things, you know, with your engine in the back end. Very, very economical on gas. That's why it was so popular in this country. Sweden tried to counteract it by introducing the Saab. The Saab had the engine in front, and the Saab didn't have the durability that the Volkswagen had. Those things, they were little, but you could probably squeeze maybe 5 people in, at the most. And, you know, a very, very economical vehicle to have. And it will soon be a collector's item. So any of you want to get something on the cheap right now before the price goes out of sight, now's the time to do it. Another vehicle that the Germans introduced in World War II that never really caught on was a car that ran on charcoal. It was sort of a takeoff, if you will, on the Stanley steamer. You know, a car that was, I won't say it was popular, but back around the World War I, the early 20s, when it ran on water power. You had a heater in the car, and it heated up water, and the steam made the car move. Unfortunately, it also led to a number of highway tragedies because a lot of Stanley steamers would overheat and blow up. And they didn't last long, obviously. But at the end of World War II, with the Germans running out of fuel accessories, the Palestine oil fields in Hungary, which had been bombed by the Allies, had been occupied by the Soviet army toward the end, cutting off Germany's supply of fuel. And so in order to move their vehicles, they came up with the idea of firing up furnaces with charcoal. And this would generate enough energy to move the vehicle. It couldn't move them very fast or very effectively. And it did not work on their tanks, but it did on their smaller military vehicles. Their tanks still required good old-fashioned gasoline to move. But like everything else, come the end of World War II, the charcoal vehicle went the way of the dodo bird and became a fact of history. So a lot of things that happened. In many cases at the end of World War II, the petroleum industry became very, very powerful. And anything that challenged the use of petroleum in a vehicle, they opposed. And they were able to lobby Congress, and they opposed it very, very effectively. There are many other ways to power your cars. There was certain vegetable oil which could be used to power a certain type of engine, not your internal combustion engine that we have now in our vehicles. But this was proving probably to be maybe a little bit too successful, and the petroleum industry fought it, and they pretty well killed it. There's a farm down in Bennington where they use some kind of vegetable oil to power their farm vehicles, and it works very well. But they're unable to get it on the market. They're not able to sell it. And it's largely because of the powerful lobbying influence of the petroleum industry. Well, toward the end of this month, in fact, it's July 30th and 31st on CNN, the second round of, I won't call it debates because they're not really debates, it's more or less a panel discussion of 20 candidates seeking the Democratic presidential nomination will take place. And the dates on CNN, July 30th, July 31st, and will be at 9 p.m. on CNN. One person has already dropped out, but another multimillionaire has stepped in. So the number remains the same. But I think probably as we get it, when they have their September, October debates, I think you're going to see the field whittled down. Right now there are 24 people seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, or at least 24 that said they are, and there may be a few more thinking about it. The top 20, and this is based on how they do in the polls and how much money they have raised over a certain period of time to make them a viable candidate. The top 20 will be divided in two groups of 10 and 10. And the four at the bottom of the list, of course, will be home watching it on TV. As we begin the whittling down process, it really won't move in a big way until after we get into the primaries, beginning with Iowa and then into New Hampshire and South Carolina. By the time you get into South Carolina, that field will probably be down to around 12 or 15, and more will drop out. As I look at the field and watch them, and I watched both sessions, I think the second group was a little more interesting. First group was pretty much Elizabeth Warren sort of came out as the best prospect on that group. The second group, of course, you had more people. Well, of course, Joe Biden, naturally. Kamala Harris, the junior senator from California, did very well. And there were a couple of others that didn't do too bad. There was a congresswoman from Iowa that may hang around for a while. She may catch fire and hang around for a while, but I thought she had some very good ideas. Christine Hildebrand from New York State, I think she will be dropping out before too much longer. Another one, the former congressman from Texas, Beto O'Rourke. I thought he did fairly well, but I think he could do better, and hopefully he'll be better prepared next time around. The mayor of South Bend, Indiana, handled himself very well. But I see him sticking around for a while, but I don't think he's going to be there at the finish line. I think when you get down to the finish line, it's going to be Joe Biden. I think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are going to eliminate each other. I know I'm saying that here in Vermont, and a lot of people are going to say, hey, not our Bernie. How can he talk against our Bernie? But Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are more or less appealing to the same group. And you can't be both, okay? And that's why I think they're going to eliminate each other. Plus, I think Bernie's campaign is starting to lose steam. I mean, he came on very, very strong, and I think he's hanging in there, but I think momentum is starting to slip away. And I think people are saying, well, he's got some good ideas, but some of them are a little bit too far out. You know, like free college tuition. Yeah, that'd be great. But you know, in this life, and Elizabeth Warren advocates the same thing, but I think we know in this life that nothing is free. Somebody pays for it. And when you talk about free college tuition, who's going to pay for it? Well, in the long run, it's going to be the taxpayers. So even though they appear to be free, everybody's going to be paying for it at the end. And at the age of 86, I may be paying some into it, but not too much, because I don't think I'll be around that long. But at any rate, things are heating up. The liar in the White House still going strong with his tweets and getting all mixed up on history, you know. If you think the British had airplanes in World War I, all the more power to you. So with that, have a great week here in July. We've got some beautiful days coming up. We got some rainy days coming up. May Almighty God in His infinite wisdom continue to bless these United States. Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you all next week.